The massive space station called Nexus Prime floated in the darkness between three star systems. Ships from dozens of different worlds came here to trade goods and share knowledge. The station was huge, with spinning sections that created artificial gravity. Bright lights marked the docking bays where vessels of every shape and size waited in neat rows. Captain J. Ho guided his small transport ship toward one of the empty docking ports. He had made this journey many times before, but today felt different. His passenger was not a typical trader or tourist. In the ship's small cabin sat a quiet man named Timon, who wore simple gray robes and carried only a small travel bag. "We are almost there," J-Ho called back to his passenger. "First time. On Nexus Prime?" Timon nodded and looked out the small window at the enormous station. "It is much larger than I expected. How many beings live here?" "Maybe 50,000 on any given day. They come from all over the galaxy to do business. You will see species you have never heard of before." J-Ho activated the docking sequence. "Are you sure you want to stay here for 3 months? It can get pretty wild." "I am here to learn and to share what I know," Timon replied calmly. "The cultural exchange program believes it is important for humans to understand other species better." The ship shuddered slightly as it connected to the docking port. Through the speakers came the voice of station control, speaking in the common trade language that most species understood. "Transport vessel Happy Journey, you are cleared for boarding." "Welcome to Nexus Prime." J-Ho powered down the ship's engines. "Well, this is it. Remember what I told you about station security. Commander Yule runs a tight operation here, but he is fair to everyone who follows the rules." Timon gathered his belongings and bowed slightly to the captain. "Thank you for the safe journey. I hope to see you again when you return." The airlock opened with a soft hiss, and Timon stepped onto the station for the first time. The main corridor was wide enough for 20 people to walk side by side. The walls were made of some kind of metal that seemed to glow with its own light. Other beings moved past him in both directions, some walking on 2 legs like humans, others moving in ways that seemed impossible. A tall creature with blue skin and 4 arms noticed Timon staring and made a sound that might have been laughter. "First time off your homeworld, human?" "First time on a space station," Timon admitted. "It is quite remarkable. Wait until you see the central plaza. That is where the real action happens." The creature continued down the corridor, its 4 arms moving in a rhythm that reminded Timon of ocean waves. Following the signs written in multiple languages, Timon made his way toward the central plaza. The corridors gradually became wider and more crowded. He passed shops selling goods from distant worlds, restaurants offering foods he could not identify, and small groups of beings engaged in conversations using languages that sounded like music or machinery. The central plaza opened up before him like a vast indoor park. The ceiling stretched up so high that it disappeared into shadows, and artificial sunlight streamed down from hidden sources. Trees and plants from many different worlds grew in carefully maintained gardens. A fountain in the center sent water high into the air in patterns that seemed to dance. Beings of every description filled the plaza. Some sat on benches talking quietly, others walked along the paths between the gardens, and a few conducted business deals at small tables scattered throughout the area. The air hummed with dozens of different languages and the sounds of life from across the galaxy. Timon found a quiet spot near one of the garden areas and set down his bag. The journey had been long, and his body felt stiff from sitting in the small ship. He looked around to make sure he would not disturb anyone, then began his daily practice. He started with simple breathing exercises, standing perfectly still with his eyes closed. His breathing became slow and steady, and the tension in his muscles gradually faded away. After several minutes, he began to move. The movements were slow and flowing like water moving down a gentle slope. Timon lifted one arm while shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His other arm followed in a sweeping motion that seemed to capture something invisible from the air. Every movement connected smoothly to the next one, creating an unbroken chain of graceful motions. A small creature with large eyes and fur covering its body stopped to watch. It tilted its head to one side, clearly puzzled by what it was seeing. Soon, Another being joined it, then another. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered around Taemin. The human continued his practice, unaware of the attention he was attracting. His movements became more complex, involving turns and steps that carried him in a slow circle around his starting point. Sometimes he moved as if he was pushing against something heavy, other times as if he was drawing something light toward himself. "What is he doing?" asked a voice from the crowd. "Some kind of dance, I think," replied another. "Very beautiful. Look how smooth his movements are. Is this some kind of human entertainment?" The crowd grew larger as word spread through the plaza that something interesting was happening. Beings pointed at Taemin and spoke in excited whispers. Some began recording the performance with their personal devices. Dr. Hana, a human xenobiologist who had been studying plant samples near the gardens, noticed the commotion and pushed through the crowd to see what was happening. When she saw Taemin, she smiled with understanding. "It is not a dance," she explained to a curious alien standing next to her. "It is a form of meditation and exercise that humans call martial arts. Very old tradition." "Martial arts?" The alien looked confused. "But it looks so peaceful, so graceful." "Yes, it is meant to bring peace to the mind and strength to the body," Dr. Hana replied. When Taemin finished his practice, the crowd burst into spontaneous applause. Several beings stepped forward, offering credits and other forms of payment. Taemin looked surprised and somewhat embarrassed by the attention. "Thank you, but I cannot accept payment," he said politely, using the translation device on his belt, so everyone could understand. "This is not entertainment. It is personal practice for health and spiritual growth." The crowd seemed confused by his refusal, but they applauded again anyway. Slowly the beings dispersed, returning to their own business but continuing to glance back at the unusual human. Commander Yule, the station's security chief, watched the scene from his office overlooking the plaza. The Vorthok had reptilian features and cold, calculating eyes that missed nothing. He made a note in his daily report about the human entertainer, marking him as harmless but worth monitoring due to the crowds he attracted. "Interesting," Yule said to himself as he watched Taemin gather his belongings. Another human with their strange customs. Taemin picked up his bag and began looking for the temporary quarters that had been assigned to him. As he walked through the plaza, several beings approached him with questions about his practice and requests for private performances. He answered their questions patiently, but continued to decline any offers of payment. By the time he reached his small quarters, word of the human dancer had already begun to spread throughout the station. In the markets, the cantinas, and the docking bays, beings talked about the graceful human and his mysterious movements. None of them realized they had just witnessed something far more significant than a simple dance. 3 days had passed since Taemin arrived at Nexus Prime, and his morning practice had become the most popular attraction in the central plaza. Every day at the same time, beings from across the galaxy gathered to watch the human perform what they believed was an elaborate dance. The word had spread through the station like wildfire. Traders paused their negotiations to catch a glimpse of the graceful human. Even the busy dock workers took breaks to see the mysterious movements that seemed to flow like liquid music. Taemin remained unaware of his growing fame. Each morning, he found his quiet spot in the plaza, set down his small bag, and began his practice exactly as he had done for 20 years. The breathing exercises came first, then the slow, flowing movements that helped center his mind and prepare his body for the day ahead. On this particular morning, a young Zeltharian with purple skin and 3 eyes approached him after he finished. The creature held out a handful of glowing crystals. "Please, honored dancer, accept these rare gems from my home world. Your performance brings great joy to my heart." Taemin smiled gently and shook his head. "I am grateful for your kindness, but I cannot accept gifts. What you see is not a performance. It is meditation and exercise." The Zeltharian looked confused. "But the movements are so beautiful, so perfect. Surely this is art meant to be shared." "It is shared," Taemin replied. "Anyone may watch and learn, but it is not entertainment that requires payment." Word of the exchange spread quickly. Some beings began to understand that the human took his practice seriously. but many still saw it as a form of artistic expression. Small groups started trying to copy his movements, treating them like popular dance steps that might catch on throughout the galaxy. In the markets, vendors began selling recordings of Taiman's daily sessions. Some enterprising aliens even started offering lessons in human movement art, though none of them truly understood what they were teaching. Kangde, Taiman's younger brother, arrived on the station that afternoon aboard a diplomatic vessel. As a member of the Human Cultural Exchange Program, he had come to check on how well the mission was progressing. He expected to find his older brother quietly studying alien customs and sharing human philosophy with interested scholars. Instead, he walked into the central plaza to find hundreds of beings gathered around Taimin, who was demonstrating a series of slow kicks and arm movements to a group of fascinated youngsters from various species. "Brother," Kangde called out after the crowd dispersed, "I see you have made quite an impression here." Taimin looked embarrassed. "I do not understand why they find my morning practice so interesting. I have tried to explain that it is not entertainment, but they keep gathering to watch." "Maybe because they have never seen anything like it before," Kangde suggested. "To them, it probably does look like a form of dance, very different from their own cultural expressions." "Perhaps you are right, but it troubles me that they want to pay me for something that should be freely shared." Kangde nodded, but his expression grew serious. "There is something else we need to discuss. I have been hearing rumors about increasing tension on the station. Some of the more aggressive species are not happy about the growing human presence here." "What kind of tension?" "Territorial disputes between trading factions, competition for the best docking spaces and market locations. The Bruthans arrived yesterday, and they are already causing problems." Taimin had heard of the Bruthans. They were a warrior species known for their size, strength, and violent temper. Most other beings tried to avoid them when possible. "What does this have to do with me?" "Some of them have been asking about the human dancer. They seem to find the whole thing amusing in a mocking way. I heard one of them say that humans must be very weak if their greatest skill is dancing." Taimin considered this information calmly. "Misunderstanding often leads to conflict. Perhaps I should speak with them, explain what my practice truly represents." "That might not be wise, brother. The Bruthans respect only strength and direct confrontation. They see diplomacy as weakness." That evening, Taimin walked through the station's various levels, observing the different species and their interactions. He noticed the tension his brother had mentioned. Conversations stopped when certain groups passed by. Some beings moved quickly through areas where others gathered, clearly trying to avoid conflict. Near the lower docking bays, he encountered a group of 5 Bruthans. They were enormous creatures, each standing nearly 3 meters tall with thick, muscled bodies, covered in natural armor plating. Their faces were angular and fierce, with small eyes that seemed to constantly look for threats or challenges. The largest Bruthan, who appeared to be their leader, noticed Taimin walking past and called out in the common trade language. "You are the human dancer we have heard about?" Taimin stopped and turned to face them. "I am Taimin. I practice martial arts each morning in the central plaza." The Bruthans looked at each other and made sounds that might have been laughter. "Martial arts?" The leader stepped closer, his voice filled with contempt. "That flowing, gentle movement you do? That is what humans call martial arts?" "It is one form, yes. There are many different styles and approaches." "We are Gorthak and his warriors," the leader announced, pounding his chest with one massive fist. "We know martial arts, real martial arts, combat that proves who is strongest, who deserves to live." The other Bruthans growled their agreement, flexing their considerable muscles and showing off scars from previous battles. "Your dancing might entertain the weak species on this station," Gorthak continued, "but it would not last 1 second against true warriors like us." Taimin remained calm, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Strength comes in many forms. What you see as dancing is actually a very old form of combat training. It teaches balance, timing, and the efficient use of energy." "Balance? Timing?" Gorthak laughed loudly. "Combat is about power and speed, about crushing your enemies before they can move. Your gentle dancing would be useless against real fighters. Perhaps we understand combat differently, Taemin replied diplomatically. In my tradition, the greatest victory is achieved without fighting at all. This statement made the Bruthans even more amused. They whispered among themselves in their own language, occasionally glancing at Taemin with expressions of disbelief. Without fighting? Gorthak shook his massive head. How can anyone win without fighting? How do you prove you are strong enough to survive? Strength is not only about physical power, it is also about wisdom, self-control, and understanding. Soft. Human philosophy, one of the other Bruthans muttered. No wonder your species is so weak. Taemin felt a slight tightening in his chest at the insult, but he maintained his calm expression. We may see things differently, but I respect your perspective. Gorthak stepped even closer, his shadow covering Taemin completely. Your dancing amuses the children and traders on this station, human, but do not mistake their applause for respect. When real danger comes, your pretty movements will not save you. The Bruthans walked away, their heavy footsteps echoing through the corridor. Taemin watched them go, feeling a growing sense that his peaceful mission on Nexus Prime was about to become much more complicated. Unknown to him, word of the encounter was already spreading through the station's communication networks. The confrontation between the gentle human dancer and the fierce Bruthan warriors had been witnessed by several beings, and the story grew more dramatic with each telling. By the time Taemin returned to his quarters, everyone on Nexus Prime was talking about the challenge that seemed inevitable. The next morning, Taemin arrived at the central plaza to find it more crowded than ever before. Word of his encounter with the Bruthans had spread throughout the station during the night, and beings from every level had come to witness what many believed would be his final performance. Taemin noticed the unusual tension in the air but proceeded with his normal routine. He found his customary spot near the gardens, set down his bag and began his breathing exercises. The crowd watched in unusual silence, many of them glancing nervously toward the main entrances to the plaza. Dr. Hana stood near the front of the crowd, her face filled with worry. She had heard the rumors about what Gorthak and his warriors were planning. As a fellow human, she felt responsible for trying to warn Taemin, but she also knew that interfering might make the situation worse. Commander Yule observed from his office high above the plaza. The Vorthak security chief had increased patrols throughout the station, expecting trouble. His reptilian eyes tracked every movement in the crowd below, looking for signs of impending violence. Taemin began his practice, his movements as smooth and graceful as always. He lifted his arms in a sweeping motion, stepped forward with perfect balance, and turned in a slow circle that seemed to capture the attention of every being present. The familiar flowing sequences continued, each movement connecting seamlessly to the next. Then the crowd parted. Gorthak and 4 other Bruthan warriors entered the plaza from the main corridor. Each warrior was fully armed and wore the battle gear of their species. Their heavy footsteps echoed across the plaza as they approached Taemin, who continued his practice without acknowledging their presence. "Human dancer," Gorthak called out, in a voice that carried to every corner of the plaza. "We have come to see this martial art you spoke of yesterday." Taemin completed his current movement sequence and turned to face the Bruthan leader. The size difference between them was enormous. Gorthak stood nearly twice as tall as the human, with arms thicker than Taemin's entire body. "Good morning," Taemin said calmly. "You are welcome to observe, as is everyone here." "Observe?" Gorthak laughed, and his warriors joined in. "We did not come to watch more dancing. We came to see if your martial arts can do more than entertain children." The crowd pressed closer, forming a large circle around the 2 opponents. Some beings tried to leave, sensing that violence was about to erupt, but most stayed to witness what they believed would be a historic confrontation. Elder Malik, an ancient being whose species was known for their wisdom and long lives, pushed through the crowd to get a better view. Unlike the others, he did not watch Taemin with casual interest. His old eyes studied the human's posture, the way he held his hands, the slight shift in his stance as he faced the Bruthan threat. "I have told you before," Taemin said, "the greatest victory is achieved without fighting." There is no need for violence between us. Without fighting, Gorthak pulled a massive weapon from his belt, a club that could easily crush bones. How do you plan to defeat 5 Bruthan warriors without fighting? I do not wish to defeat anyone. I wish only to continue. I practice in peace. This response made the Bruthans even more aggressive. They saw Timon's peaceful words as evidence of cowardice, proof that humans were indeed too weak to survive in a galaxy filled with dangerous species. Your peaceful practice ends today, dancer, Gorthak snarled. Today you learn what real martial arts look like. Sujin, a human trader who had been conducting business in the nearby markets, arrived at the plaza just as the confrontation was reaching its peak. She recognized Timon from the cultural exchange program and immediately understood the danger he was in. This is not fair, she called out to the crowd. 5 against 1 and they are all armed. Some beings in the crowd murmured agreement, but no one dared to interfere with Bruthan warriors. The reputation of Gorthak's clan was well known throughout this sector of space. Timon remained perfectly still, his breathing slow and controlled. To the watching crowd he appeared calm to the point of being unaware of his danger. But Elder Malik noticed something different. The human's weight had shifted slightly to the balls of his feet. His arms hung loose at his sides, but his fingers were relaxed in a very specific way. Last chance, human, Gorthak raised his weapon. Beg for mercy, and we will make your death quick. I cannot do that, Timon replied quietly. But I ask you one more time to reconsider. Violence will not prove what you think it will prove. It will prove that humans are weak and Bruthans are strong. No. Timon's voice remained calm, but something had changed in his posture. It will only prove that some beings choose violence when other options exist. Dr. Hana noticed the change too. As a xenobiologist, she had studied human behavior extensively. The way Timon was standing now reminded her of documentation she had seen about ancient human warriors, soldiers who had fought in wars long before humans reached the stars. Gorthak raised his weapon higher, preparing to strike. Your dancing ends here, human. It is not dancing, Elder Malik said quietly to the beings around him. Look at his stance. Look at how he holds his hands. This human knows exactly what he is doing. But his words were lost in the noise of the crowd. Most beings were too focused on the massive Bruthan warrior to pay attention to the small human, who seemed so helpless before him. Timon closed his eyes for just a moment, centering himself as he had done thousands of times before. When he opened them again, his expression had not changed, but something fundamental had shifted. The peaceful monk was still there, but now there was something else as well. I had hoped this would not be necessary, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza. But you leave me no choice. Gorthak laughed one final time. No choice but to die like the weak creature you are. The Bruthan warrior raised his weapon high above his head and brought it down toward Timon with enough force to shatter stone. The crowd gasped, many beings turning away from what they expected to be a gruesome end to the gentle human dancer. But Elder Malik kept watching. His ancient eyes were fixed on Timon, waiting to see if his suspicions were correct. The massive club whistled through the air, aimed directly at Timon's head. At the last possible moment, the human moved. It was not the desperate scrambling of someone trying to escape. It was not the panicked flailing of a victim facing death. Instead, Timon moved with the same fluid grace he had shown during his morning practice, but now that grace served a very different purpose. He stepped to the side, and the club smashed into the plaza floor where he had been standing just a heartbeat before. The impact sent cracks spreading across the reinforced surface and created a sound like thunder. Gorthak stumbled slightly, thrown off balance by the force of his own attack. He looked up to see Timon standing calmly beside him, apparently untouched by the assault that should have ended his life. Impossible, one of the other Bruthan warriors muttered. Lucky dodge, Gorthak snarled, raising his weapon again. You cannot be lucky forever. But Elder Malik was smiling now, an expression that few beings had ever seen on his ancient face. Not lucky, he whispered to himself. Skilled. The second attack came faster than the first. Gorthak had learned from his mistake and adjusted his approach. The club swept in a wide arc that should have been impossible to avoid. Once again, Taemin moved with that same flowing grace. This time, instead of simply stepping aside, he seemed to flow around the attack like water moving around a stone. His movements were still beautiful, still resembling the dance that had captivated the station for days. But now the crowd was beginning to understand that they had been watching something very different from entertainment. The third attack never came. As Gorthak tried to recover from his second miss, Taemin's hand touched his wrist in what appeared to be a gentle, almost caressing motion. Gorthak's weapon fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. The plaza fell completely silent. Hundreds of beings stared in shock as Gorthak, the massive Bruthan warrior, looked down at his own hand in confusion. His fingers would not respond to his commands. The weapon that had seemed permanently attached to his grip lay on the floor several meters away. "What did you do to me?" Gorthak demanded, his voice filled with rage and something else that might have been fear. Taemin did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved in a slow circle around the Bruthan leader, his steps as graceful as they had been during his morning practice. But now the crowd could see something they had missed before. Every movement had purpose. Every step placed him in the perfect position for what came next. "I touched a pressure point that controls the nerves in your hand," Taemin explained calmly. "The effect is temporary. You will regain feeling in a few minutes." The other 4 Bruthan warriors looked at each other uncertainly. They had expected to watch their leader crush the small human quickly and brutally. Instead, they were witnessing something none of them understood. "Attack him together," Gorthak commanded his warriors. "He cannot stop all of us." The 4 Bruthans charged at once, their own weapons raised and ready. They moved with the speed and coordination of experienced fighters, approaching from different angles to prevent Taemin from escaping. What happened next would be talked about throughout the galaxy for years to come. Taemin moved like liquid, flowing through the gaps between raindrops. The first warrior swung a heavy sword in a downward strike that should have split the human in half. Instead, Taemin seemed to melt away from the blade's path, his body bending at angles that looked impossible. As the sword whistled past him, Taemin's hand shot out and touched the warrior's elbow with 2 fingers. The Bruthan's arm went completely numb, and his weapon clattered to the ground. The second warrior tried to grab Taemin from behind, using his superior size and strength to crush the human in a bear hug, but Taemin spun away from the grasping arms like a dancer performing a pirouette. As he turned, his elbow struck the warrior's solar plexus with pinpoint accuracy. The massive Bruthan doubled over, gasping for air that would not come. He fell to his knees, his face turning pale as his breathing became labored. Elder Malik watched in fascination as the pattern became clear. Every movement Taemin made served multiple purposes. He avoided attacks while simultaneously positioning himself to strike at vulnerable points on his opponent's bodies. It was like watching a master musician play a complex piece, where every note was perfectly placed. The 3rd and 4th warriors attacked together, trying to trap Taemin between them. One swung a mace at his head while the other aimed a spear at his chest. There seemed to be no way for the human to avoid both weapons at once. Taemin dropped low, his body folding almost in half as both weapons passed over him. From his crouched position, he swept one leg in a wide arc that caught both warriors behind their knees. As they fell backward, his hands struck out like striking snakes, touching each of them at specific points on their necks. Both Bruthans collapsed to the ground, unconscious before they hit the plaza floor. Dr. Hannah stared in amazement. She had studied human anatomy for years, but she had never realized how precisely someone could affect the nervous system with nothing but knowledge and perfectly placed pressure. Gorthak looked around at his defeated warriors, then back at Taemin, who stood calmly in the center of the plaza. The human was not even breathing heavily. His robes were not torn or dirty. He looked exactly as he had when the confrontation began. "This is impossible," Gorthak said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "You are small, weak. How can you defeat trained warriors?" Size and strength are not the only forms of power, Taman replied. You judged my abilities based on appearance rather than substance. Rage filled Gorthak's eyes. His hand had begun to regain feeling, and he bent to retrieve his weapon. I will show you what real power looks like. The Bruthan leader charged with a roar that echoed throughout the plaza. His weapon swept in wild arcs, trying to catch Taman with sheer unpredictability rather than skill. But Taman seemed to anticipate every movement. He flowed around Gorthak's, attacks like smoke drifting through a forest. Sometimes he bent backward so far that his head nearly touched the ground. Other times he seemed to compress his body into impossible positions that allowed the massive club to pass harmlessly overhead. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the battle became a deadly dance. Gorthak's attacks grew more desperate and less controlled. Sweat poured down his face as he tried again and again to land a single blow on his elusive opponent. Taman's movements remained as beautiful as they had been during his peaceful morning practice. But now everyone could see the lethal purpose hidden within that beauty. Each step, each turn, each graceful gesture served to avoid death while preparing to deliver it. Commander Yule watched from his office, his reptilian eyes wide with shock. In all his years as a security officer, he had never seen combat like this. The human's fighting style was unlike anything in the military databases of any known species. End this, Gorthak gasped, exhaustion finally slowing his attacks. Stop playing with me and fight. I am fighting, Taman replied. But my way, not yours. The human's next movement was different from all the others. Instead of flowing away from Gorthak's attack, he moved directly toward the Bruthan leader. His hands came up in what looked like a gentle embrace, but Elder Malik recognized the technique from ancient texts he had studied. Taman's fingers touched specific points along Gorthak's neck and spine in a sequence that took less than 2 seconds to complete. To the watching crowd, it looked like the human was patting the warrior in a friendly manner. Gorthak's eyes went wide. He tried to speak but found that his voice had disappeared. He tried to move but discovered that his legs would no longer support his weight. Most terrifying of all, he realized that his breathing was becoming more difficult with each passing moment. He fell to his knees, then onto his side, his massive body no longer under his control. His chest rose and fell in increasingly shallow movements as the pressure points Taman had touched began to shut down his nervous system. The plaza was so quiet that the sound of Gorthak's labored breathing could be heard throughout the vast space. Every being present understood that they were witnessing the end of one of the most feared warriors in this sector of the galaxy. Taman knelt beside the fallen Bruthan, his expression filled with sadness rather than triumph. I am sorry it came to this, he said quietly. You forced me to choose between your life and the safety of innocent beings on this station. Elder Malik stepped forward from the crowd, his ancient voice carrying clearly in the silence. What technique did you use? It is called the 5-point death touch, Taman replied without looking up from Gorthak's still form. It disrupts the flow of energy through the nervous system. He will stop breathing in less than a minute. Can it be reversed? Taman hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but only if he understands what he has learned today. He looked down at Gorthak, whose eyes were filled with terror and confusion. Do you still believe that strength comes only from size and weapons? Gorthak tried to speak but could only make a small gasping sound. Do you understand that judging others by appearance can be a fatal mistake? The Bruthan managed a tiny nod. Taman's hands moved again, touching the same pressure points but in a different sequence. Gorthak's breathing immediately became easier, and feeling began to return to his limbs. You will live, Taman said, standing up. But remember this lesson. True strength comes from wisdom, discipline, and understanding. Physical power without these things is nothing more than the ability to destroy. Gorthak struggled to his feet, supported by 2 of his warriors who had regained consciousness. His face was pale and his eyes never left Taman as he and his surviving followers retreated from the plaza. The crowd remained silent for several more moments, then burst into a sound unlike anything heard before on Nexus Prime. It was not applause or cheering, it was something deeper, more primal, It was the sound of hundreds of different species expressing awe and respect for something they had never imagined possible. But Taemin did not acknowledge their reaction. He simply picked up his bag and walked quietly toward the exit, leaving behind a plaza full of beings who would never again mistake human gentleness for weakness. Within hours of the confrontation, recordings of the battle had spread throughout the galaxy. The footage showed the same graceful movements that beings had been watching for days, but now everyone understood what they were really seeing. The flowing motions that had seemed like dance were revealed to be a sophisticated combat system, more deadly than any weapon. News networks from dozens of species broadcast the story with headlines that all carried the same message. Humans were not the peaceful, harmless beings they appeared to be. Hidden beneath their diplomatic smiles and cultural exchanges was a warrior tradition that could destroy enemies without seeming to make any effort. Ambassador Wu Jin arrived on Nexus Prime 2 days after the incident. The senior diplomat had been sent by the Human Cultural Exchange Program to assess the situation and determine how to proceed. He found the station in a state of complete transformation. Where once beings had looked at humans with casual indifference, now they watched every human visitor with a mixture of respect and wariness. The 3 other humans on the station reported that their treatment had changed dramatically. Aliens who had previously ignored them now approached with careful politeness, offering better deals and more comfortable accommodations. Commander Yule met with Ambassador Wu Jin in his office overlooking the central plaza. The Vorthax security chief had spent the past 2 days updating his files on human capabilities and completely revising his station's security protocols. "I must admit," Yule said, his reptilian eyes studying the human diplomat carefully, "we severely underestimated your species. How many of your people possess these combat abilities?" "That is difficult to answer," Wu Jin replied diplomatically. "Many humans study martial arts for health and spiritual development, but very few reach the level of mastery that Taemin has achieved." "Very few? How few?" "Perhaps 1 in 10 million. Taemin has dedicated his entire life to understanding the ancient arts. Most humans who practice martial arts do so as a hobby or for exercise." Yule made notes in his security files. "And this 5-point death touch technique?" "Even more rare. There are perhaps a dozen humans in the galaxy who know those pressure point methods. The knowledge is closely guarded and passed down only to students who demonstrate complete self-control and moral discipline." "I see." Yule leaned back in his chair. "This changes everything we thought we knew about human capabilities. If one of your monks can defeat 5 Bruthan warriors single-handedly, what might your military forces be capable of?" Ambassador Wu Jin smiled. "That is exactly the kind of thinking that led to this confrontation in the first place. Not every human is a warrior, just as not every Bruthan is a philosopher. We are individuals with different skills and interests." In the central plaza, Taemin continued his daily practice, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The crowds that gathered now watched with respectful silence instead of casual entertainment. They understood that they were witnessing something sacred, a tradition that connected physical movement with spiritual discipline. Elder Malik had become a regular observer, arriving early each morning to study Taemin's techniques. The ancient being had spent centuries collecting knowledge from across the galaxy, but he had never encountered anything like human martial arts. After Taemin finished his practice on the 3rd morning, Elder Malik approached him with a formal request. "Honored Master," the elder said, using a title of respect that few beings had ever earned, "I have studied the fighting arts of 47 different species, but I have never seen anything that combines beauty, efficiency, and spiritual depth the way your martial arts do. Would you consider accepting me as a student?" Taemin looked surprised. "I am not a master, Elder Malik. I am simply someone who has dedicated his life to learning." "That is precisely why you are a master," the elder replied. "True masters never stop learning. They understand that knowledge is a journey, not a destination." Word of Elder Malik's request spread throughout the station. Soon other beings began approaching Taemin with similar requests. A young Zeltharian wanted to learn the breathing techniques. A middle-aged Corvani asked about the philosophy behind the movements. Even a few Bruthans, members of different clans than Gorthaks, expressed interest in understanding how such devastating power could be controlled with such discipline. Dr. Hana watched these developments with fascination. As a xenobiologist, she understood that they were witnessing the beginning of a new form of cultural exchange. Humans had brought something to the galaxy that no other species possessed, and now that gift was being shared in ways that could change interspecies relations forever. "Are you going to start teaching?" she asked Taemin one evening as they shared a meal in the station's human-friendly restaurant. "I am not sure I am qualified to teach," Taemin replied. "What I practice is the result of thousands of years of human tradition. It cannot be learned quickly or easily. But you could share the principles, the philosophy behind it. Help other species understand that strength and peace can coexist." Taemin considered this suggestion. That might be possible. The physical techniques are less important than the mental discipline that guides them. Over the following weeks, Taemin began holding informal sessions in the plaza after his morning practice. He did not teach combat techniques, but instead focused on the breathing exercises, meditation methods, and philosophical concepts that formed the foundation of martial arts. His first student was Elder Malik, who proved to be a dedicated and insightful learner. The ancient being's questions challenged Taemin to think more deeply about his own practice and helped him find ways to explain human concepts in terms that other species could understand. Soon, a small group of regular students had formed. They came from different species and backgrounds, but they shared a common interest in understanding the balance between physical capability and spiritual discipline that human martial arts represented. The change in how other species viewed humans extended far beyond Nexus Prime. Diplomatic relations shifted as alien governments reassessed their understanding of human capabilities. Trade negotiations became more respectful. Cultural exchange programs expanded as other species sought to learn from human traditions. But perhaps the most significant change was in how humans saw themselves. The incident had shown the galaxy that human gentleness was not weakness, but choice. The capacity for violence existed alongside the commitment to peace, and knowing the difference between the two was what made humans truly strong. Su Jin, the human trader who had witnessed the confrontation, found that her business dealings had become much more profitable. Other species now treated her with the same respect they showed to diplomats and military officers. She used her improved position to help other human traders establish better relationships throughout the sector. Gorthak and his warriors had left Nexus Prime the day after the battle, but their story spread throughout Bruthan space. Other warrior clans began to reconsider their assumptions about human weakness. Some even sent representatives to study human combat techniques, though they found few teachers willing to share the more dangerous aspects of martial arts. 3 months after his arrival, Taemin prepared to leave Nexus Prime. His mission as a cultural ambassador had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, though not in the way that had been planned. On his final morning, he performed his practice one last time in the central plaza. The crowd that gathered was larger than ever, including beings who had traveled from distant worlds specifically to witness the human martial artist. When he finished, Elder Malik stepped forward to address the assembly. "We have learned much from our human friend," the ancient being said. "We have seen that strength can be gentle, that power can be controlled, and that the most dangerous opponents are often those who appear the most peaceful." The crowd responded, with the deep, respectful silence that had become the traditional response to Taemin's practice. Then slowly, beings from dozens of different species began to move in coordination, performing the basic breathing exercises and simple movements that Taemin had taught them. It was not a perfect reproduction of human martial arts, but it was something new. A blending of human wisdom with the diverse capabilities of dozens of different species. Each being adapted the movements to their own physiology, while maintaining the core principles of balance, control, and respect. Taemin watched this spontaneous demonstration with tears in his eyes. This was what the cultural exchange program had hoped to achieve. Not just the sharing of information, but the creation of genuine understanding between species. As the crowd dispersed, individual beings approached Taimin to offer their personal thanks. The young Zeltharian who had first offered him crystals now spoke about how the breathing exercises had helped him control his natural anxiety. The Corvani businessman explained that the meditation techniques had improved his ability to negotiate fairly with other species. Even a representative from the Bruthan clans approached, offering a formal apology for Gorthak's behavior and requesting permission to send students to learn from human teachers. "Your martial arts have shown us that true strength requires wisdom," the Bruthan said. "We wish to learn this balance." Captain Jeho arrived that afternoon to transport Taimin back to human space. He found his passenger very different from the quiet monk he had brought to the station 3 months earlier. Taimin carried himself with the same humble dignity, but there was something new in his eyes, the confidence of someone who had faced a terrible choice and made the right decision. "I heard about what happened," Jeho said as they prepared for departure. "The whole galaxy's talking about it. Are you ready to go home?" Taimin looked back at the station one final time. Through the viewing port, he could see the central plaza where Elder Malik was leading a group of new students through their morning exercises. "Yes," he said quietly. "But I think home has expanded to include more than just human space now." As their ship pulled away from Nexus Prime, reports were already coming in from other stations and worlds. Requests for human martial arts instructors were arriving from governments, universities, and cultural centers throughout the galaxy. The Human Cultural Exchange Program was struggling to meet the demand for teachers qualified to share not just the physical techniques, but the philosophy and discipline that made them meaningful. Dr. Hana had volunteered to stay on Nexus Prime for an extended period, documenting how different species adapted human martial arts concepts to their own cultures. Her research would become the foundation for a new field of study called interspecies kinesthetic philosophy. Commander Yule updated his final report on the incident, concluding with a recommendation that would be adopted by security forces throughout the galaxy. Human beings should never be classified as non-threatening, based solely on peaceful behavior. Their capacity for both creation and destruction makes them perhaps the most dangerous species in known space, precisely because they choose when and how to use their capabilities. Back on Earth, the Martial Arts Council convened an emergency session to discuss the implications of what had happened at Nexus Prime. Masters from every discipline gathered to debate whether human fighting techniques should be shared with alien species, and if so, how to ensure they were used responsibly. The debate would continue for years, but the decision had already been made by events. The knowledge was spreading, adapted and modified by each species that encountered it. Human martial arts were evolving into something larger than their origins, becoming a galactic phenomenon that bridged the gap between physical power and spiritual wisdom. Elder Malik established the first interspecies martial arts academy on Nexus Prime 6 months later. Students came from across the galaxy to study not just human techniques, but the principles that united all forms of disciplined combat. The Academy's motto, inscribed in dozens of languages above its main entrance, captured the lesson that Taimin had taught through his actions. True strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when destruction is necessary, and the discipline to act with precision when that moment arrives. The story of the human whose movements looked like dance until his enemies stopped breathing became legend throughout the galaxy, but those who truly understood the lesson knew that the most important part was not the stopping of breath, but the choice to restore it when understanding was achieved. In the years that followed, the phrase dancing death entered the common vocabulary of dozens of species as a description for something that appeared harmless but concealed great power. It became a reminder that in a galaxy full of diverse beings, appearances could be fatally deceiving. And somewhere in the vast reaches of space, on ships and stations and worlds throughout the galaxy, beings of every species began their days, with slow, graceful movements that honored both the beauty and the terrible responsibility of true power. The dance continued, but now everyone understood what they were really watching.